if you could please introduce yourself and your role at the Women's Resource and Development Agency.
I'm Judy Seymour, and I was director at the WRDA between 1994 and 2003. So I took over from Joanna.
Thank you. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your own journey as a feminist?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, are you born a feminist, or are you made one? Maybe it's a bit of the two. But I was adopted, and when I got my adoption papers, actually not so long ago, I discovered that on the 2 sheets of A4 that were the kind of contract between the local authority and the couple who adopted me. And it clearly says that I'm female and gives my female name, Christian name. And then every other line after that starts with he, his, he, his. So that was like, that was kind of setting the story up, if you like. And then when I was 11, I had to do the 11 plus, like everybody did. Years and years later, I discovered that I had to get, in order to pass the 11 plus, well, first of all, if I didn't pass the 11 plus, I would go to the secondary modern school, which I was terrified of, because I'd been taught that it was a sixth school and it was the end of life as we know it. So I had to get into grammar school. But then I discovered in my 30s, when I was doing some research, that the pass mark for girls was higher than it was for the boys, because otherwise there would be more girls going to grammar school than there were boys, and you couldn't have that. And then when I went to university, I think there was 7% of the population went into higher education. And I don't know what the figure is for class, what the breakdown is by social class, but I imagine that working class people weren't that well represented. And I've never been able to find a figure for gender representation, but there were 3/4 of the people on my course were male. Then I left there and I went to France, and I joined a radical political theatre company, and it was terrific. It was counterculture, it was anti-capitalist, anti-consumerist, actually already talking about climate change, very loud, get in the middle of the audience and shout at them, it was really wild stuff and wonderful. And we had like young people in our audiences tearing up their passports and tearing up their money, that was the thing of the day, really. It was great. It was also deeply sexist. It was run by guys, and if as a woman you wanted to have influence, then you would need to sleep with one of them. It was fairly straightforward, So I was there for a couple of years, and then the group imploded, and I came back to England via Paris with one of the women from the company, and she had women friends in Paris, who were involved in le mouvement de libération des femmes. And so I got to meet some of those women. And this is like, we're talking 1971, something like that. So post 1968 uprising, and out of that flowed a lot of outrage and anger. And those women in Paris were really angry. I think it just kind of started to open up my imagination. And I bought, on the way home, I bought a copy of Germaine Greer's Female Eunuch. And then it was just like, it was just opening up my mind and seeing what was in there and how much of it was, shite, basically. And then I had a baby, and so I was, I was very involved in bringing up a wee girl. And about 4 or 5 years on, I set up a project, a community arts project, community arts, working with young people in community settings. And we called it Kids Mobile Workshop, but the kids themselves called it them wifeys because we were 2 women. And wifey is a kind of, I'm not sure that that's an expression that's used in Northern Ireland, is it? It's a Geordie expression, and it's used by young men to describe any woman who's like 3 years older than them, it's wifey. So we had a little deliberation about whether or not it was a good thing to call ourselves, and I thought it was. I think, I don't have a problem with that, let's take it on, so we became them wifeys, and that then evolved into a women's collective working, doing a lot of work with girls and young women, and supporting the women youth workers who were employed by the local authority but had very little support. In fact, were really, working against what the local authority thought they should be doing. So we set up self-defense for women and for youth workers. We did loads of adventure activities. It was very physical, and actually we set up football. I'll just read you a little bit from this because I just think it's brilliant coming this year. Football, it was good. We went to the YWCA in Gateshead and we did a football competition with lasses from other groups. It was all girls and we had a good laugh. There was loads, 50 to 70, God knows. We went in the evenings because we were all on schemes in the day, and they showed me new skills and that. And we were one-to-one with each other. And this man, he was the football instructor. We don't know his name, but he was only little and he was dead canny. And I thought that was just amazing. So that's 40 years from that work, getting girls access to play football, to being in the final of the World Cup. And I think, 40 years, it's really, really helpful thing to have an idea of time spans, which is something I thought a lot about in relation to what we're talking about this morning, slow, steady, small, patient work over and over and over again actually does bring about change. But they do go on to say something less complimentary about me. Jan's only here once a week and it's too much for her to do all that. And Judy's a lazy swine. Roars of laughter. Yeah, so from there into women's education, I became really, I did a master's in education management, and as part of that, I did a lot of research into gender and education and second chance education. I was working in the West End of Newcastle in a very multicultural area. I did a lot of work with Asian women, and we produced a book called The Daughters of the East. And then everything, started to kind of fall apart. There was a change of leadership in the local council, in Newcastle City Council, and community education was no longer the flavour of the moment, and it started to become quite a hostile environment to work in. So when I saw the opportunity to work with the WRDA, it was just like all my dreams come true all at once.
Thank you, Judy. You moved to Northern Ireland to take up the post of Director with Women's Resource and Development Agency in 1994, just after news of the historic ceasefires. You mentioned this in the 1994 annual report, saying, "What a time to arrive in Northern Ireland. To say I am excited at the prospect of a new home, new set of challenges, and the opportunity to work with the Women's Resource and Development Agency is really an understatement." I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your memories of that time and the transition to living and working in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I do remember just how overwhelmed with privilege I felt, to be in this situation at this point in history was just amazing. But also, obviously, I didn't know anything. That was also how I felt. And I remember somebody saying, well, you know, one of the good things about you is that you don't have any baggage. You're here and you don't have any baggage, and that's great for us. And I was thinking, I don't feel that way at all. You know, I felt I got like, I don't know, going back to the 12th century's worth of baggage. And actually it took reading Anna Burns' Milkman to really kind of clarify, put into words just how I felt at that time. So, you know, I come from a background where we taught politics all the time. We were marching, playing music, putting on performances. When we weren't doing that, we were talking politics, and I couldn't imagine not being able to talk politics. And I just remember finding out that I couldn't do that. You know, it really wasn't cool. And the first kind of real indication of that was, I think it was the second week after I'd started work, and I was invited by Sir Patrick Mayhew to dinner at Hillsborough. He was having a group of people working at community level, and I think he was hoping for some gossip, maybe, or wanting to take soundings. And I clearly remember the look of fear on Geraldine and Liz's face as I left the office that afternoon to go off to Hillsborough. And I don't remember if it was Liz or Geraldine saying, whatever you say nothing. Loose tongues for lives. And I was kind of thinking, what an opportunity. Here you are, you're going to meet the Secretary of State, you have an opportunity to talk to him, and you can't say anything because you don't know anything. You know, not only would it always have to be a very kind of considered conversation you're having, but actually you're too new here. You don't, you know, how can I do this without letting people down? So that kind of newness was really yeah, was quite hard to deal with. I mean, being in a new job, obviously, I think you have a honeymoon period. So I did feel that I could ask questions that maybe other people couldn't ask, and that's actually quite useful. So you can have some very good conversations by asking questions. So really, it was about just kind of, yeah, making the most of that window to ask opportunities and to ask questions, and know that some of them would be stupid and you get away with it, but you know, hope not to ask too many that would let down the WRDA. And the other thing, of course, I will never forget is those first impressions of the WRDA. And Joanna was came in for a couple of weeks, just off and on, you know, just to give me some support and help me take on the role. And I mean, I just had this impression of a really well-functioning organization, a culture of care and respect. And so it seemed to me what I needed to do was to work hard at just sustaining what was already there, and kind of keep things steady until I could really kind of grasp what needed to be done. And of course, it was absolutely stony broke. I mean, you know, really, there was no money in the bank. And I mean, that could have been awful. And it was in some ways, but actually everybody else was in the same situation. You know, I didn't meet a women's group or a women's centre worker who wasn't struggling for money. And I think, you know, one of the things about not having money is that you compare yourself to people who have, and when they have and you haven't, it makes you feel bad. But if they haven't and you haven't, it's not half as bad, you know. And in fact, it would have been very uncomfortable if the WA had money when nobody else did. So it's quite lonely, actually. And Belfast, the town centre, on a weekend, you know, there was still a kind of, not exactly a curfew, but you had to go through a checkpoint. I don't know, was that the continuation of was it the steel ring? I think it was maybe still there. And it was, to me, it was very hostile anyway. So, you know, what do you do? What do you do for enjoyment? And just down from Mount Charles was the Crescent Arts Centre, and they put on life drawing classes on a Friday. I mean, imagine life drawing classes on a Friday evening. What are you doing on Friday night? I'm going to a life drawing class. Yay! But I did, and so did about 20 other people, and it was that was my introduction to painting, which has then kind of taken hold, and now I've spent a lot of my time doing it. But yeah, I kind of look back on that and I think, gosh, life is very different.
In what ways was the women's movement and sector in Northern Ireland either different or the same to the women's sector in England?
I mean, there obviously, there's a big difference. We weren't having the troubles, but there are a lot of similarities in that women were marginalized and getting very active. So we were reclaiming the night. We had a lot of consciousness raising groups going on. So it kind of went very quickly, I think, I remember going to a women's liberation conference in London. It must have been the second women's liberation conference. And gradually the women around me, we were starting to talk about feminism. And it went from that to, well, are you working class or are you middle class? Are you black? Are you white? Are you disabled? Are you gay? Are you straight? And then you kind of got that kind of what at first felt like quite conflicted, and then actually became, I think, as we learned to navigate it a bit. I mean, we wouldn't have used the word intersectional, but it was about developing those kind of bonding and bridging things, So in that way, I think probably quite similar to Northern Ireland, but we didn't have a women's sector because we didn't have women at the grassroots feeling, I don't know, kind of engaged or empowered. We had feminists who would be in roles working along, feminist principles, but never with the means to connect things in the way that I think, because Northern Ireland grew, the women's sector grew from the grassroots. And so I think that's the main thing that kind of sticks out for me. For example, I mean, in the job description that I got from the WRDA, there was mention, I think, of there being 50 women's groups in Belfast. And I just assumed, I didn't question it, I just thought, oh, that's a typo. Because in Newcastle, we had a women's centre, and Newcastle's the same size as Belfast, pretty much. So we had a women's centre run by volunteers, open 2 evenings a week. And we had a rape crisis centre. And there was lots of other stuff, but that was our resource compared to what you had in Northern Ireland. So there's no comparison really.
Thank you, Judy. Did what are often kind of called orange-green issues, did they ever kind of bleed over into the work of the women's movement here? And if so, kind of how did you handle that problem?
I think I would just look to Geraldine actually. Or Patricia. I think there was a bit of whatever you say nothing, actually. And again, I would kind of go back to Anna Burns' book, because she just describes it so wonderfully, the innuendo, and, that you would, like, some people would know, you would know by, I don't know, the way an eyebrow was raised, or I wouldn't recognize it. In some ways that was a strength. but also, you know, unintended consequences and all of that. It was, you know, it was also, we needed to be careful with that one. But I don't know. I mean, in a way, do you not think that the fact that those tensions were obviously front, you know, at the front of everything, but the fact that the women, I mean, Kathleen, the Women's Information Group, the work that Kathleen did, and the work that the women's centres did between each other, you know, creating the Women's Support Network, creating mechanisms for women to talk to each other across, you know, across both communities. Is something that I hope that women were and are incredibly proud of. It's just such a wonderful thing to achieve. And, you know, you compare that with the way that the women in the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, the way they were treated in the peace talks, you know, how they were denigrated and trivialized. You know, you can see what the alternative could have been if the women's sector hadn't been there doing the work that they were doing. So it should be a source of immense pride, I think, the way that the women managed it.
Thank you, Judy. Just talking there about the Women's Coalition. What role did the Women's Resource and Development Agency and the women's movement generally have in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement and all the negotiations that went into that?
I mean, I think the founding of the Women's Coalition was just a brilliant move. The time was right. It provided a focus for women to imagine it being different, you know, and that act of saying, well, what if we don't think about the border? What if we don't consider that issue, but we just look at the kind of society that we want to be and that women need, and what are the changes that women need to see, and how might we put those into an agreement? Just the act of doing that, of imagining, you know, let's imagine, that is such an important strategy, and nobody else was doing it that way. So I think that was probably a major contribution, and I don't think that would have been possible without the backup from the women's groups and the women's sector, the women's networks and so on, and you know, the work that had gone on previously of just building that kind of solidarity. Yeah, and I think that backup was there, and with Mo Molam. I mean, Mo Molam, in my eyes, is kind of honorary member of the women's sector, and it was always connected to the women's groups, to the ground, you know. So that was the local women's groups. I don't think their reality was ever out of the picture. Yeah. And then again, you know, I think when you look at, I already referred to, when you look at the way that women in the Women's Coalition, the way they were treated. I mean, at the time, it kind of, I was shocked, and one of the women rang me one afternoon, and I think she just needed to vent, and she talked about how when she left the talks. When she left Stormont, sometimes she had to go home and wash. And I remember just thinking how horrible that was. But when I look at it now, I just think, you know, that was an act of violence. There are women willing to be brave enough to you know, put themselves forward and to work for peace, and at the very table where peace is being talked about, they're being treated with violence. So yes, I mean, I think there was there was backup and support, but at the same time, I also think, you know, that is traumatic, and often it takes years for trauma to really become apparent. And I do wonder about the long-term impact of that on women's mental health. You know, certainly, well, I think across the Northern Ireland community, actually. And because now, you know, there is allegedly peace, then a lot of that kind of support, those support mechanisms, I imagine, fall away because there's not a need for them anymore. But actually what you have is an accelerating experience of trauma, because I think it comes in waves, you know, and I wonder how that's being dealt with.
Thank you, Judy. Just to kind of pick up on what you were saying there about how the peace has sort of brought with it its own issues. I was wondering if you could talk about the impact that peace had on the women's movement in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, I think the contribution of the Women's Coalition around policy, so policy appraisal and fair treatment, section 75. I don't know whether I'm right, but I associate that very much with the Women's Coalition. So putting, you know, yeah, getting that into the agreement, so then that becomes a statutory requirement to do that work. And on the other hand, you know, I do remember the pile of consultations on my desk, you know, coming in on a Monday morning, including one from the Seed Potato Society. And I think, did I make that up? But no, there was one from the Seed Potato Stakeholder Group or whatever. So it made a lot of work, you know, and I think that got very quickly brought into the work with the community facilitators, because, you know, clearly they were the best placed people to do that kind of consultation. You know, if I wouldn't have, if I had thought I could go into a local area and ask what women thought about, you know, whatever policy issue, then I don't think I would have got the same answer as the real answer that a community facilitator would get. So, you know, it kind of it started to make things kind of functional at a different level, at a more complex level and a more impactful level. What they had done, the Women's Coalition, I think, is to open up our understanding of democracy, create opportunities for a wider range of action and ways of engaging. And then, of course, there was the Peace and Reconciliation Programme, and we were all thirsty for resources, weren't we? So, you know, that was exhilarating, I think, to have a funding resource. And again, you know, the way in which that was managed, oh, it was so disappointing when I came back to England. But the way that was managed through participatory budgeting, or that, you know, the funds that NIBT held, was just wonderful. You know, you came together, and there was a point at which I was at a conference twice a week. But you know, you come together, you've got the heading, you've got the you know, this is what this program is called and what it has to deliver. Now can you sort out exactly what that means to you on the ground, you know? And so you've already got your little store of ideas because you've been nursing these projects for years. But now they're in a different context, and now you're hearing what other people's ideas and projects and longings are, and maybe there's an opportunity to link up with each other. And you know, even if you don't link up, you're much better informed. And then, you know, and then, yeah, it's co-opetition. I think cooperation to build the cake, and then competition to get a slice of it. So I think that's the point at which you start to see the women's sector really starting to be effective, you know, at a wider range of levels, the connection with policy, and you know, just that bit of statutory backing to what you're doing, just like was very helpful. So yeah, it was good.
Thank you, Judy. In 1998, the Women's Resource and Development Agency headed a major review of the women's sector that was called The Women's Sector into the Next Generation. This review mapped the sector, its stakeholders, and set a sector-wide agenda. How did this important conference and review come about, and what was its impact?
Well, we were looking, I think at that stage we didn't know if there was going to be a new peace programme, so we were very much looking at, you know, money, where is it going to come from? And it was a conversation that I had with Stevie Johnston, who was, I'm not sure if he was the director or the assistant director at that point of the WEA. And Stevie had come across Future Search he was visiting the States, and he told me about it. He thought because it was a kind of whole systems thing that it would be a helpful thing to consider in terms of building an infrastructure, getting common agreement and common agenda. And so he put me in touch with Ruth McCambridge, who is one of their facilitators, and I chatted with Ruth, and it sounded really interesting to me because it sounded as if it would enable us to move from being, I mean, I think the women's sector at that point would have been seen to have been, you know, kind of very abundant with all sorts of different kind of things going on, but I don't think anybody, least of all us, you know, saw it, understood it as a system. And I think what Future Search promised to do, and what I think it did, was to to shape what we were doing as a system, where you had a very clear sense of how individual elements, how essential they were, how they related to other elements, and how that created an ecosystem. I mean, I'm now talking with my 2000 and what are we 2000 and whatever hat on, you know, and I think in terms of ecosystems these days, actually that's what it was, that's what it is. It's organic and it's connected and it's living and breathing and dynamic. And I think, you know, that kind of got set down very, very early on. So one of the first tasks you have to do with Future Search is you have to work out who your stakeholders are. And you can have 80 people in the room, and we were recommended by Ruth that there should be 8 tables. Right, so we could have 8 stakeholder groups. I mean, that wasn't rigid, but that was just a kind of, this is how it usually works best. And we had, I remember the meeting sitting in the top room in Mount Charles, and group of women from the women's centres, regional representation. It was a fairly representative group. And we're saying, well, okay, so obviously the women's sector are stakeholders, but, you know, is that one stakeholder group or is it 2, or, you know? And so we tried, okay, let's look at a typology. It looks to me like there's women's groups, there's women's centres, there's women's networks, and there's women's projects. How does that feel? Does that resonate for you? And we're going, yes. And there it was, you know, it was done. It was actually, you know, you'd think that might have been a conversation that would need to go on for ages, but it actually fell into place extremely quickly. And that's because it was already there, but we just hadn't seen it, you know. And then the other stakeholders, as far as I can remember, were providers of education, the health service, community development, the department of the DHSS, community, there's Department of Communities or something like that. And the way of working was to work in single stakeholder groups, so you get a sense of what your mates, what you thought needed to be done, and then, you know, an hour later you would sit down with a mixed stakeholder group, and you would be sitting next to people who didn't necessarily agree with you, and you would need to have the discussion, and you would need to come up with something that you could all stand over. And maybe there would be things that would be too difficult. I mean, there was definitely a too difficult list, but you know, it was just a wonderful process, and took place over 2.5 days. And I have here, can you see that? Have you got a copy?
I think we do. I will have a look in our archives and try and find it, but that's great. So is there anything else that you want to say about how that project came about, or what its impact was?
When I look at a little while ago, I had to do a talk for the Fawcett Society on the WRDA. I let the WRDA know I was doing it. So I was doing this talk for the Fawcett Society, and I wanted to just see what kind of things the sector were doing now, you know, to kind of bring it up to date. And it was just amazing looking at everything that people were doing, but also, to me, one of the things that came out of Future Search, and again, it's not that Future Search created it, but it's that Future Search sharpened the focus, I think, is the importance of working collaboratively. So the importance of connecting across, you know, community, wider spatially, connecting spatially, connecting areas of discrete work and so on. And when I looked at what people were doing, this was about 2 years ago, like, you know, it was platform, collaboration, partnership, alliance, joint working, cooperative working, you know, and it was just like, oh my gosh. And, you know, did I kind of look at the outcomes of the Future Search at the time? And one of the weaknesses of Future Search is if you can't, if you don't have a resource to revisit it and to, you know, to kind of check in with each other, then it can fall away. But to see, you know, maybe it wasn't to do with Future Search, but I like to think that it was, that there is still this and a bigger even emphasis on cooperative and collaborative working. And I just thought that was lovely.
Thank you, Judy. That's good to share. In 2002 then, that was a very tough year financially for the women's sector. Statutory funding was cut and staff were lost from 42 women's groups, including the Women's Resource and Development Agency. What are your memories of that turbulent year and how you steered us through it?
You know, it's really, it is odd because I'm so familiar with organisations not having money. I'd never worked in an organisation that had money. Even when I was working for the local authority, you know, we were constantly being cut. So facing a financial crisis is, you know, very familiar, sadly. And normally I would just approach that by, okay, so that's, you know, that funding's run out, so we'll do, you know, I would have a plan B and I'd probably have a plan C as well. But I think at that point, and I honestly, I don't remember it that clearly because I think it was probably, you know, just put it away. But I think it was very difficult. I think maybe that was where the hope wore thin. It was very difficult to see what the alternatives were going to be. If it must have been an uncertainty about, because P&R, Peace and Reconciliation money, was always coming to an end. You know, it was always only a year or 2 years. So it must have been a point at which a lot of programs were coming to an end and we couldn't see a way ahead. And so I think it just must have been that, you know, there was, I actually felt it very personally because I didn't have a solution. I think that must be what it was, you know. I didn't have a solution except hope. And that's not great, you know, that doesn't communicate very well to your staff. And it's always a huge responsibility to, you know, if you're responsible for making sure that people can pay their mortgage or their rent or put food on the table or feed them their kids, you know, it's a big responsibility, obviously. And I guess I didn't know how you were going to do it. So it was a hard one. But it was happening to everybody else. I mean, that's the other side of it, you know. So it was button up and just, you know, just get on with it.
Thank you. You were talking there about that was a point where the hope wore thin. I think it's very true that the road to women's rights is a long one, and hope and joy are very important factors in sustaining the work of the women's movement over decade-long campaigns. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the kind of role of hope and joy in holding the women's movement sort of together and moving us forward.
And I think this is what I probably wouldn't have known this at the time, but I think where I am now, where I'm very involved in climate activism, that we talk quite a lot about hope in groups that I'm involved with, and whether that's just a foolish thing, you know, kind of. And that's where Joanna Macy's book, I've referred to this already, Active Hope, has been enormously helpful to us. And it also, you know, helps thinking, as I have been over the last couple of weeks, about the WRDA's 40th birthday, the role of hope in Northern Ireland. And in fact, actually in one of those images that I showed you of the Future Search, women have written hope several times. So the peace process obviously raised hope, but it has to, if it's going to endure and carry you through, then it has to deliver something. So Joanna Macy talks a lot about active hope, and she talks about, first of all, you have to acknowledge the truth. So in a sense, you know, the women's sector is actively revealing the truth about what it is to be a woman in Northern Ireland society. Yeah, there's an American activist called Walida Imarisha, and I love this quote from her. She said, "The decolonization of the imagination is the most dangerous and subversive form, for it's where all forms of colonization are born." I think, you know, that's, when I was talking about my journey into feminism, you know, that was the point when I was in Paris and talking to those women and reading Germaine Greer. The colonization of my imagination, what would it be not to have to think that the only way I could have influence was by sleeping with a man, or the work that the Women's Coalition did in terms of enabling us to imagine a different kind of Northern Ireland. Yeah, so we're talking about a process here, and I think this is what Joanna Macy makes clear, that you have to acknowledge the truth. So that entails being able to imagine something different, and then if you can go forward together, because it's very important not to be on your own with this, but if you find yourself, if you can be in a group of people going forward together with the truth, and then start talking about what can we do, then there's joy in that action, because it's actually about, it's empowerment, it's agency. And I sometimes think that was the strength of the community women's groups, that they could have been helpless in that situation, just watching their communities just be destroyed around them, and they chose instead to come together and do something, do whatever they could. And it might be very small, but they were doing whatever they could, and that gives you a sense of agency and meaning. And that those are two such important qualities of life. It's just, for me, that's where joy can come, the joy of being together. And we're not going to let them get us down. We're just not going to let them get away with it. So, but it's very important, I think, to be conscious of your mental state, where you're at on a spectrum. I mean, we all kind of, most of us anyway, different points on the spectrum at different times, but collectively we can do so much to help keep the hope alive. And it's something that we used to say on women's marches about the spirit. You can't kill the spirit. Was that it? That's going back. So yeah, it's joy in action. It's taking action. It's having agency, even if it's a small step. And look at 1970, when we were doing girls football, and here we are on the but also, I have to say this, actually, it's really important to remember. It's really important to keep records and tell the story. I mean, one of the biggest things that happened, actually, that women achieved in England in this period was through the Greenham Common peace camps. Okay, so I don't know whether you know about the Greenham Common peace camps, but over 7 years, women occupied the land around Greenham, which was housing, it was an RAF base housing US nuclear missiles. And it started with 38 women sitting in around that fence. They were there, sorry, those 38, but they were joined by thousands of women. They were there for 7 years. The missiles were removed. There were peace camps all over Europe. It's 38 Welsh women started this. And I was having a conversation with a young woman recently, a theatre director. She was working with a group of young climate activists, and she is smart as anything, and really clued in. And we were having a conversation about what makes, how do you bring about change, and what's an effective strategy, and what's women's contribution been to that? And I said, well, Greenham Common is a wonderful example. And she said, well, what's Greenham Common? And she'd never heard of it. So, when you're trying to bring about social change, one of the things that we most come across in climate work is people saying, what's the point of me recycling, or what's the point of me doing, because it's so big, there's nothing I can do about it, so I might just as well be doing what I was doing before. But it is these small actions. And actually, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm going to make a little, what I'm calling a box of treasures, which is just examples of things that people have done. So Greenham Common women, Northern Ireland women, your story is a way of unlocking the imagination, of getting rid of decolonizing the imagination, and of giving other people hope as well. And in that sharing and communicating and the telling of the story, we can support each other. I see so many synergies between Northern Ireland and climate action groups here. So yes, we can support each other and have joy together.
Thank you, Judy. That's a nice hopeful note. What are you most proud of from your time at the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and what do you feel is the organisation's greatest achievement?
I mean, I have to say that I don't feel proud personally, because I didn't do anything individually. It was a collective. So, you know, I'm incredibly proud of the work, a lot of the work that we collectively did. And, you know, I'm so proud of having been there. And as far as the WRDA is concerned, yeah, it's the same thing of just playing its role. I mean, I was doing some work around resilience with some artists not long after I come back from Ireland, and we had an artist working with. So it was a workshop. We were a bunch of artists talking about resilience, and the artist, wonderful woman, Josie Madge, she was painting and drawing as we were talking. So we were there a day and she painted the whole thing. And we started out by saying, what's your image of resilience? And people came up with, and at the end of the day, we said, what's your image of resilience? Oh, Josie, what's the image of resilience, please? And there she had a boat with somebody scanning the horizon and happy sailors eating. And that, you know, that image, I think, is the WRDA. It's scanning the horizon, looking at the future. You know, where are the opportunities? How hard is the wind blowing? Where are safe harbors? How are people feeling? You know, let's go and have a cup of tea and sit in the coffee room and, you know, have some cakes and have a laugh, kind of stuff, you know. And I think I think that's WRDA. That's, you know, for me, that's an image of WRDA, and that's something, a very fine achievement.
Thank you. Do you have any memories or any anecdotes about our past AGMs?
I was always exhausted by the time the AGM came. When I was in with WRDA, our AGMs were in December, and the run up to that included there were always funding applications going on, but the money would be running out in March. There was a GHSS evaluation, which, you know, GHSS were our core funders, so that was, like, you know, serious. So and there was, you know, the normal kind of workload to do. So I was always absolutely tired, and it was a joy to know that Geraldine would be making sure people were there with the right information and the right papers, and that our chair, whoever she was at that time, but always wonderful chairwomen, would take us through the meeting, and I would, you know, I would be there and hopefully would be able to answer questions. But, you know, it wasn't, and it was the run up to Christmas, of course, as well. So you know, I would also be proud for the fact I would have flu on Christmas Eve. So those are my memories of the AGM.
Do you have a message for our 40th AGM?
Oh, well done, you people. Yeah, big hug. I think I would, all I would say is, what are your plans for 20 years' time? You know, what do you hope the women's sector will have achieved, and how would the WRDA have, what role would the WRDA play in that? I think this time thing is really important. I think, you know, one of the problems with the funding situation is that you're pushed through 1 year, 2 year, 3 year cycle. That's as far ahead as you can plan. I assume that you're still having to do something new because, you know, it's always about being innovative and how you dress up the same thing yet again, you know, to make it look the way it needs to look if it's going to attract funding. So yeah, the ability to look ahead. I mean, it's so important, and it's so easily forgotten. So I hope somehow that the WRDA will find the time to take a long-term view. But whatever you do, you'll do it brilliantly.
Thank you, Judy. That's lovely. Thank you for joining us and sharing some of your memories with us. I have really enjoyed this interview, so thank you for sharing.